All right, button pressing has commenced, and here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown, and whether you are a new listener or a returning friend, I would like to welcome you and express my gratitude that you are choosing to listen. I don't know where you are or when you are in the world right now when you're listening, but maybe we would just take this moment to notice how we're feeling and take a little stock. As I sit here on a Sunday morning recording this intro for this week's podcast, I'm noticing that I feel okay, that my pain level has really reduced some because I had a big flare recently. And I'm wondering about that process. It's certainly one I've been through many times. There's like these patterns and cycles that I think I go through and I imagine other people go through. And as yoga teachers, we hope to develop some awareness about these patterns. And it's amazing to me how whenever I do find myself in this place where my pain levels have abated and I'm feeling pretty good, and then I'm looking back at the process of where I was when the pain levels were like high and I wasn't feeling very good, and then when it seems like my system comes back into more of an ordered or harmonious state. And what is it that helps that, or what are the things that I'm doing? Because it's certainly not just technical. It's not just doing the right forms and doing the right breathing. That there's something much subtler that happens. And I think most yoga teachers observe this in other ways, just in the context of their classes, where if you have someone who's coming to your class regularly, over time, you can observe changes and shifts that happen in someone through practice. You don't actually know necessarily what's happened with them unless they tell you, but you can see some shift and change. Like, I have often had this experience where someone comes to my class regularly for at least 6 months to a year or something like that. And I'm watching them practice, having had this time with them. And I have in my head an image of the first time they came to my class. And it's so drastically different. Like, so obviously there's been some big shift or change in this person. And I don't know that the person always has a sense of it in the same way that I do, having just stood there and watched them practice for the last year. And the shift and change is, yes, a physical thing that I can see, but it's almost always also related to other things that have happened for them in their lives. And I think that's what, yoga therapists, when they talk about doing the kosha model, or we talk about subtle aspects of practice where transformational things happen for people. It's on this very subtle level. And I think teachers who've observed that, we're always interested in trying to understand that process just for ourselves and then in our facilitation for others. And I'm always interested to talk to other people who seem to be inquiring into the same thing, which is certainly true for my guest today, Jeff Bailey. Jeff was recommended to me as a guest by more than one person, like in the same week, which was interesting and I don't believe was coordinated at all. I don't think he set them to it at all. This was just like random. Two people who didn't even know each other both recommended him to me. And I read his new book. He's got a book called Mobility for Life, Healthy Joints, Strong Bones, and a Peaceful Mind with AVITA Yoga. And Jeff and I connected on this very thing I was just talking about, on what is this subtle process of healing and what are the elements and the essential aspects that would be in place for it to occur. So it was wonderful to connect with Jeff on this, and it's my pleasure to be sharing it with you today. Real quick before we get to it, let me mention that I have a new online teacher training group starting in October. And right now, you can get an early registration discount of 40% off. So if you've been connecting with the show and you're looking for a vehicle to deepen your personal practice and expand your knowledge base and either start a teaching practice or rejuvenate a teaching practice, then now is the best time to consider doing my training. If you're not familiar with it, it is based in a co-creative process that's designed to fit to your individual needs. And it's by far the most comprehensive offering that I have. And for a limited time, you can get an early registration discount of 40% off. So I encourage you to check it out. Also, if you want to connect with me in other ways, there's opportunities for us to do that. There's ongoing live classes. There's a weekly discussion group. Or maybe you would want to dig into the full-length archives and become a supporter of this show with a podcast premium subscription. All of my stuff, the training and the rest can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, y'all, we will leave it there. I am going to touch base with you on the other side, but let's go ahead and get to it. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Jeff Bailey. Hello?
Hey, Jay.
Hi, Jeff.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going pretty good. How are you, sir? Nice to meet you.
Yeah, good to meet you.
I'm just doing a quick check, make sure everything's in place. It looks like it is. You good? You need to do anything? We're already recording. If it's okay, I want us to consider ourselves having just begun.
Okay, cool. But did I get the note? No video?
I'm not going to use it. I don't know if you like to have it on. We can turn it off. I mean, some people to have it on for the conversation, but I don't want people to feel like they have to get dressed and like be ready to be on camera for the conversation. I want it to feel more chill. I don't know if some people find it draining to be having the video on. Some people like to have it on. They feel like they can connect more. So I'm happy to defer to you what you prefer.
No, I like it on. It's nice to have the connection visually.
I used to not like it as much. I used to kind of feel like it drained me, but I think I've gotten used to it over the years on how to do it in a way that makes sense. And in any case, I like I said, I don't want people to feel like they have to like produce video in order to be on the show. I want it to be as low key as we can. But again, happy to meet you. I've had more than one person say you should have Jeff on, like in the course of 2 weeks. So I always take that as a sign.
Yeah, I take those as signs too. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, that's and cool. Also, I've had like a couple days to sit with your book. I didn't get through all of it yet, but I have to say I can see why they suggested you to me. If anybody who listens to the show or sort of knows where I'm about and some of the questions I'm most interested in asking, a lot of those things are things that you're looking to address some in your book. So I'm just glad to have this moment with you. Thanks for making the time.
Yeah, I think you ask the good questions, and sometimes those are the hard questions. So I'm all in.
Very cool. Well, I think the interesting thing for me initially was just noticing something that I don't always see that in other people, but one of the things that you're doing off top, you've named your approach or your school AVITA Yoga. And in all of those sort of introductory things, you sort of have to start by talking a little bit about what makes it different than other approaches. And it's just interesting, like every time, like I had a new person come in this morning who I never met before, like the first thing I say to them is, there's two things that I think might distinguish this practice from other practices. And it's interesting that we feel like we need to try to set some different kind of context for what we're going to do, because a lot of times when someone comes walking into the room, there's like a set of expectations or a context for yoga that's very different.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I'm curious about why you feel so compelled to create a different context. Like, what is it that you feel like is happening in other yoga classes that you want people to set aside in order to take your class?
Wow, good question. Well, it always brings me back to the fundamental question: yoga joins, and what does it mean to join? And that was my mantra all through my 20s as I practiced yoga. And what if you were asking me, what do I need to set aside to do the yoga? The answer for me would be everything. I got to set everything aside, because the idea is to completely empty my mind and join in the oneness we share. Now, that's pretty abstract answer, I know.
No, I like that you went there. I was abstract. It's a good answer. It's a good answer. I guess I can get us a better place to start from. We jumped right in there with a very hard question. I suppose you went to what your experience is and what you would be setting aside. And I read a little bit about your history in practice. Did you start out in other kind of movement modalities? I know you studied Rolfing as well. Were you a Rolfer before you got into yoga, or did you get into yoga before you got into Rolfing?
Yeah, it's a rich story. I'll give you the lowdown succinctly. I feel like my yoga training began in my youth with my dad, who was a rural veterinarian in Gunnison, Colorado. And I had my hands in everything. I helped him with surgeries, dogs hit by cars, and cats that get themselves into a mess, and stitching muscle tissue back together, and watching how the muscles and the animal and parts of the animal respond when they're in pain, when they're under anesthetic, as they're coming out of anesthetic, and just watching all this. And then going, he was a large animal veterinarian as well, and he would quiz me when we'd come back from calls on the physiology and anatomy. And I learned so much from my dad at a very early age. And then at about the age of 21 or so, in 1985 or so, I'm not really good with numbers, but that's when I discovered yoga. And I took my first class and turned to the instructor and said, "What does yoga mean?" And he said, "It means to join." And I immediately thought, why'd we spend an hour pulling ourselves apart? It didn't add up, but I was so drawn to it. And so all through my 20s, I just kept practicing. I traveled a ton and practiced with lots of different teachers, never really gravitated to any one style, but also never stopped asking that question. And then at about the age 30, in 1990, I moved back to Colorado. I landed in Boulder and discovered A Course in Miracles, which I don't know if you've ever heard of A Course in Miracles,
Sure.
But I opened that book. I was on the floor in my roommate's house, and I was renting at the time, and there was the book on the shelf. I was on the floor doing my yoga, and I opened that book up, and the words to join and joining, and it just sort of jumped out of the book at me, and I thought, oh my God, there's my answer. And so that book became the backbone to my entire life, and it became my spiritual path. And just learning it, really, you could say the course is a training in how to follow intuition. And that led to Rolfing. So yoga got me into the course, and then yoga got me into the Rolfing world. So I brought all that in. And I will often say, when people ask me about my background in yoga, I will say my Rolfing training was the best yoga teacher training I ever had, because we really learn a lot about patterns, the patterns that work against us, how to resolve restrictions, and where the restrictions exist, which is not in the muscles, it's in the fascia that's all around fascia concentrates near the bones and joints. And that is what got me thinking much, much more about fascia and joints than the typical muscle approach.
Well, interesting. I've had friends who were Rolfers in the past. I've had a few sessions done on me. And I know, like, when I first heard about Rolfing, I guess there's like quite a bit of I don't know, maybe like in a lot of different modalities, there's a kind of a spectrum of different approach within it. I don't know, because I remember initially when I first heard about Rolfing, it was like crazy intense, and you had to like sign up for these amount of sessions, and they would stick fingers in people's noses, and it was intense and hard. And then I know other people who seem to go about it in a different sort of way. I suppose for you, going from A Course in Miracles to Rolfing is an interesting leap. I also read there was also like your own physical stuff that I imagine played into that, like your own physical injuries. I know you had like a hip injury, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I often say there may be injuries, but there are no accidents.
Hmm.
Because my injury, my knee injury is really what pushed me toward Rolfing. I ended up as a model in the first advanced teacher training, and I was surrounded by the just the best Rolfers on the planet that were helping me with my knee. And it was very moving experience. And you're right, it reaches into us in emotional and psychological ways whenever we start really kind of getting into the body. And that's part of the yoga too, that we'll probably get to here at some point, of how it brings the stuff up where it can be resolved.
Mm.
But yeah, the course kind of became the background. I wouldn't say necessarily the course moved me toward yoga or toward Rolfing. Yoga came along, then Rolfing, and Rolfing just had this impact. It answered a lot of questions for me. And then I mixed the two together. I would put my clients in yoga shapes, and and we're taught to apply pressure. It's time and pressure on fascia, and then you ask for a little movement, and that's what brings the change. And so it just kind of continued to evolve. And in many ways, I think of AVITA Yoga as self-Rolfing.
Interesting.
Cool.
We'll come back to that. We'll come back to self-Rolfing and AVITA Yoga. I guess my curiosity is still on, like, people experience Rolfing in different ways, and they don't always experience it on the level of, like, we're talking about Course of Miracles, which is pointing to like other realms. I don't know how, I don't know the right words to say it. Like, and I think it's an important conversation, the one I'm interested in, because it's one that I've had on the show quite a bit over the years about, like, there are some materialist yogis who aren't looking beyond the material, but I do think that something like A Course in Miracles, and certainly certain philosophical viewpoints within yoga, would say that there is that which is beyond the material. So if we're looking to address our physicalities, it would also be beyond just that physicality. Like we're not just machines or something, that there's a whole system that's looking to be addressed. And it seems like that's what you were pointing to. Like, when your knee was hurt, was it like a torn meniscus, and then the Rolfers were able to heal it through addressing deep patterns in you? Like, what was the experience in that initial thing with Rolfing that made you feel like, oh yeah, this is where it's at. This is the joining.
Yeah. Wow. There's a lot in that question. So let's start a little bit with the Course's perspective. I don't want to make this about A Course in Miracles, but let's talk a little bit about the Course's perspective on the body. And the Course would say the body is a vehicle for communication, which means, and what is it that I want to communicate ultimately, but love and kindness and peace, because those are reflections of true self. And that's what aligns with every saint and mystic. It aligns with what Socrates was teaching. It aligns with the Bhagavad Gita. It actually aligns very well with the Yoga Sutras, which is what my first book is all about, The Yoga Mind, which I wrote, the Yoga Sutras according to A Course in Miracles. And so there is this idea of a perennial philosophy, one love, one truth, many, many paths that point to it. And the Course it would just say, this is a line from the Course itself is one of many thousands of paths. And so I would just say it was, for me, very, very, very beautiful the way yoga and the Course, and now lots of other things that I've kind of studied, even Shakespeare. I've kind of become a Shakespearean, and I love studying Socrates and the Advaita Vedanta. They all kind of point to this one love that we share. And the whole idea is to join with that and then to practice coming from that. And that is just everything. And that's the practice of namaste, to see the light in another so that I may see it in myself. And so that's that. And with it comes this deep guidance, because we want the love to guide us. Fear doesn't get us anywhere. Okay. So that, in a matter of months, some miraculous kind of changes came when I picked up that book and started applying some of it. And now I continue to study it every day. It's been 35 years. But out of that came this little bit of inkling to trust. For example, I struggled with relationships through my 20s. I really wanted a life partner, but I couldn't hold it together. And somehow, some way, that in a little bit of reading of that book, it opened up my heart. And for the first time in my life, I remember walking through the CU campus. I was taking some graduate courses there, and it just hit me like, I'm okay. Like, I don't need another. And it was the first time in maybe forever that I felt that. And 2 weeks later, I met the love of my life, and we're still together, And so it's a good example of how letting go and letting the love and the light be our guide is everything. And so then I would go so far as to say, on some level, I was guided to go skiing, and I was determined to learn how to teleski. I had friends that were very good teleskiers, and I wanted to be good just like them. I grew up alpine skiing, so I had that down. But I remember being at the top of this run, and it was steep, and there were moguls. And I just thought, okay, I'm going to do this. I can do this. And I made like 2 turns and hyperflexed my knee, and the pain was excruciating. And I couldn't walk. They had to sled me down, and I was immobile for several days. And then I saw this ad in the paper for an ad to be a model in an advanced Rolfing training. And the guidance just said, do it. I didn't know anything about it, but I just followed that. And so what those Rolfers did with me is very practical. They used their fingers in my calf muscle and where it attaches, all the attachments in and around my knee. They freed them up, and they they helped me undo the trauma from the injury, because, the body keeps the score. We know that book. The body really never forgets. And so we want to remind the body that it is okay, and that it can heal. And we want to stop, like the way a scar, if you carve your initials in an aspen tree, that aspen tree will never stop healing the scar. Well, our body's the same way. We actually want to get it to heal and then get it to stop healing. Otherwise, you get lots of scar tissue and restriction that just kind of amplifies. And so they taught me that, and then I just wanted to teach it to others.
I get it. I think that's an interesting connection that I've experienced some, even just meeting my life partner, similarly to you, that moment of realizing that you'd be okay no matter what, that you're okay, then that sort of being this big key. And even in the way that you feel that life has a certain magic to it that it might not have at other times, and that opens up possibility, which would include the possibility to heal. So when you hurt your knee and like life just randomly puts this thing in front of you that you have no idea about, you go for it, and then you have an experience there that clearly was very formative. And even the idea of like doing things with your body and how that affects deeper patterns in us on like other layers of our being is an interesting question that I think a lot of yoga teachers have face because it's not always clear how doing breathing and moving practices get to anything beyond just ranges of motion and whatnot, or even what creates ranges of motion. Or like some of the stuff in your book I thought was really interesting, because I know you get pretty technical on like a lot of anatomy stuff. I know Bernie Clark listens to this. He should read your book because you talk about all kinds of interesting stuff that I've come across over the years that I think are pretty intriguing, which seems to me to come out of your Rolfing experience in terms of how you relate to the body and even think about like stretching, like muscle stretching, because that's like a big thing. People think of yoga is stretching. And I've been sort of trying to dispel people of that for many years. It seems like you spend some time doing that as well, right?
Yeah.
So does that kind of come out of this experience of Rolfing, or are there other things that you're drawing upon that you've come to those ideas about the way the body works?
That's what goes all the way back to my childhood. There's nothing about muscle tissue that's stretchy. Nothing. Even, whether the animal or the human being is anesthetized, we can take the nerves out of the picture. When you go under anesthetic, you de-innervate the muscle tissue. But still, if you try to stretch it, you're just going to tear it. And, it's flesh. And now here's where it gets really interesting. There's another chapter in the book where I talk about constitutions. And I've watched I've taught, over 13,000 classes. And the way I teach is I ask my students a lot of questions. I go slow and I ask questions, and I find out what they're feeling and what they're experiencing and why they're there. And this is something I teach my teachers to teach in the teacher training, because we want to teach from the student, not to them. And that makes all the difference in the world. So I started to learn that people kind of we come in with a certain constitution that tends to be somewhere on the spectrum of tight or rigid on one end and loose on the other end. And it's the loose people that gravitate toward gymnastics and dance and ballet, and it can be men or women. Women tend to be looser, but yeah, a lot of men.
I'm like a hypermobility syndrome disorder candidate.
And it's no accident you're in the world of yoga.
Yeah, no, it is.
More stretching, you learned this a long time ago, more stretching will never help you.
Not helping.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Well, I guess what I'm also sort of curious about is, and you mentioned anesthesia, because I actually kind of remember seeing these like videos where someone's got like a frozen shoulder and then you put them under anesthesia and their arm will move. And it always seemed to me that like, it seemed to imply that like what's holding our bodies and creating these ranges of motion isn't necessarily like the length of our muscles. It has something else. It's some kind of patterning that's holding us that way, That's
the patterning. Yes, and that's different. The fact that it moves when you take the nerves out of the picture is not because the muscle suddenly got stretchy and flexible. It's because because the nervous system that was holding the shoulder in a certain way and quote unquote freezing it now is out of the picture. And so you can do that, but then as the person comes back as they come out of the anesthetic, the pattern just
gradually comes right. Exactly.
Which is a beautiful example of the power of belief. So then the question is, and I love this stuff, because now the question is, how am I going to work with that person? How am I going to find shapes, not poses, but how am I going to find shapes and very specific movements that bump into the restriction, but reach into the mind to unwind it? And I have had the most remarkable stories with people with frozen shoulder. I have a good number of them. And sometimes I can say, without going into too much detail, or sometimes so in AVITA, we have passive and active movements. And sometimes it's as simple as putting their hands out in a T shape, getting them comfortable, putting a little challenge into the shoulder. And that's the name of the game. And that's how I perceive Rolfing, by the way. I was never an intense Rolfer. If you're squirming, we're being counterproductive. Then that's my feeling. And that's where I learned this idea of healing sensation. There's a difference between pain and pushing on something and healing sensation, which invites change and invites us into the peaceful mind. So I've had situations where I've had, it's usually women. There's a lot of hormonal elements in frozen shoulder and things like that. But I've had plenty of men with it too. So I shouldn't limit it to gender. But T-shape, head supported, eyes closed, calming, breathing through the nose, calming the mind, putting a couple sandbags on their hands right at the edge of the sensation on the shoulder. And then just giving it some time. I've put them they could be in a classroom, and then I go off and I teach something else to the rest of the class. Come back, make a little adjustment. They turn their head to the other side, for example. And that alone has had amazing results, because can you see how we're unwinding not just something in the tissues, but something in the nervous system and the mind?
Yes, that undoing of pattern or undoing of holding. It's a very subtle thing that you have to leave space for, it seems like, to allow for that. And it does also, I was just discussing this with someone, it involves a certain sensibility, which makes sense why we've been talking about the Course Miracles or whatever, because it's a certain sensibility that you walk in the room with in terms of how you're relating to it. And I took note, I'm looking back at my notes of one other bio note that I took note of yours, which is that at age 50, you had an injury where you were like a hip replacement candidate. Because I have had a whole bunch of hip stuff. I haven't had a hip replacement done. I guess I'm just interfacing with the Western medicine and getting the MRIs done and kind of like understanding what the different possibilities were. I don't know what was going on with your hip, but I know in some of the stuff I read in your book, you place kind of an interesting value on joint compression. And I don't know if I totally agree, but I'm curious about that. So what happened with your hip, and did you get a hip replacement or you didn't get a hip replacement?
No, I haven't. And I don't plan on it. When you go in with trauma like that, I don't want to get into the details of my hip. Among things, there was a tear on the labrum, which makes things very delicate.
I have torn labrum, just so you know.
Okay.
I understand.
So I learned a ton about that, and you have to be very, very thoughtful. In short, if there's pain on that tear, you do have to stay away from that. You can work around it a lot, but that will just add insult to injury, really. But there's so much more that you can do as long as you stay off of that tear. And that's where MRIs, I get fairly routine MRIs to just gauge my progress. And I learn, when I go to get the evaluation, I ask the doctor so many questions, because the hip is a very complicated joint, and it's really hard, very, very, very difficult for anybody who's not an orthopedic surgeon to understand where that thing is located and exactly how it moves. And it seems like it shouldn't be that complicated, but man, it's like learning, it's like architects who have to learn how to think spatially in lots of different ways. But anyway.
No, well, I really, to stop you just for a second, I really appreciate some of the things that you just said. Myself, I had like pain in my hip for a lot of years. I thought maybe it was an SI joint thing. I don't know. I waited and just tried to come up with all the things I could think to do to try to help it in terms of strengthening and all kinds of ways of trying to target muscle groups and whatnot. And eventually I just felt like, I don't I've never been a fan of getting scans. I know, like, even in your book, you talk about like MRIs and how just because you see something in MRI doesn't necessarily associate with the pain. Like, people got slip discs and no pain, and people got slip discs with pain. But I decided I wanted to go have the scan done. Like you said, I wanted to kind of like get
It's
more
good
information. Well, the orthopedic surgeon, basically what ended up being is like my joint looked great. Like, I have really good ranges of motion. I have like a totally healthy joint. I just have these like labral tears. They did the dye. We could see where they were. And in
Yeah.
a way, it has helped me immensely to kind of know that, like you say, to kind of understand, like, oh, you don't do the same thing for, like, the joint compression that you're talking about isn't going to help my labral tears. Like you said, like, that's an important distinction to make that I needed to understand. Like, spending more time in pigeon pose was definitely making it worse. So, like, kind of understanding the nature of what it was. And I do feel it's like a lot better because I've just changed, like, even like gait patterns and like a lot of other things that I've explored that have really helped it.
Yeah.
But it is like it's still that factor, it could still come back. I've had to like change how I move and what I do with my body, I think, in a lot of ways to address it.
Yeah, it does. And the biggest one is the simplest one, really, and it's stop doing the movements. It's the really dynamic triangle shape and the warrior
Exactly.
two and
No more
warrior
extended
one
triangle. I threw it out years ago.
and
Exactly
pigeon.
why.
And you just got to say, because we've been conditioned to think there's gold, like there's gold at the end of the rainbow, like there's going to be magic in those shapes, even if it hurts.
Mm.
And if it's hurting like that, if it's that deep organic pain and there's a push to attain a certain outcome, I can almost guarantee you're doing trauma. And so, and it's echoed by some pretty darn good doctors and physical therapists out there, So, but there's still a lot of shapes that you can do that will.
See, that's the thing. I think I have also swung it back too far the other way, like where you're just too scared to do anything because you don't want to aggravate it. And so kind of finding that ground. And I think you like one of your chapters of your book is even about that, where it's like you can't protect your way into better health. And I think that's kind of been a thing in the yoga world of like, I don't want anybody to get hurt in my class.
Yeah.
And I think that's I want teachers to be concerned about that, and I want them to make smart choices. But I remember having like a pain specialist, Neil Pearson, years ago. And I was asking about this, and he said very clearly, you can't help anybody from a place of fear. Like you said earlier, it's got to come from love. It can't come from fear. You can't be worried. So when you say you can't protect your way into better health, what are some of the points you're making in your book about that?
Yeah, well, it's everything that you said, because it comes from a place of fear. And the moment we protect something, we stop using it.
Mm.
And you know what happens if you don't use something? Go ahead.
It atrophies, right?
Yeah, it's the universal. I've never known a single person who didn't agree with this line: use it or lose it.
Yeah.
It applies to every single thing in the body.
And our minds.
Yeah. And so, I mean, here's a really simple example. If I believe I have a knee that hyperextends, and a lot of people have that belief, and they don't have a hyperextended knee. If I believe that, then I'm going to put a little bend in my knee in just about everything I do. I'm going to protect my knee. And guess what happens? You don't end up using a good part of your knee joint, and you don't end up using the ligaments that are designed to limit the movement. So we very, very thoughtfully start to, like, never in my entire life have I taught a class where I said, put a little bend in your knee. Instead, adjust the rest of the shape so that you can confidently, and I mean confidently, extend your knee. Okay, so then you go
All right,
in.
I have to stop you. I'm sorry because I'm a big proponent of a little bend in people's knees, and I'll tell you why. Because
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not opposed to someone straightening their legs all the way, but for years it was drummed into us in yoga classes, in a younger classes, to lift the top of your kneecaps, to totally like lock the knees. And in a way, when the knee locks, what I experience or what I observe is almost like a break. Like it doesn't, you don't see a clear pathway of weight through people's bones and their bodies engaged in like a bow and sort of sthira sukha way if their knees are totally locked. So I've often, I mean, again, I think there might be occasions or certain poses where you would go ahead and let them go straight. But I think sometimes there's a tendency for when knees lock, you're not engaging other ways through your leg. What would you say to that?
Well, I think we should do another podcast on that topic alone. That's what I would say. But what I'll say is I would go back to this idea of use it or lose it.
Mm.
And then let me say this, Jay, I would totally agree with you if it's a typical flow class. If it's a class where you're moving along and your aim is to sweat and get fit and kind of move along quickly, for sure. You don't have, if you straighten the knee out fully and quickly like that, you probably will hurt yourself. But now remember, in AVITA, we are in the shapes anywhere from 1.5 to 2, sometimes 3 minutes. And we're listening. That's the number one skill that we learn in AVITA. In fact, it's the only skill you learn in AVITA yoga is how to discern between pain and healing sensation. So if my knee, for example, let's just say I haven't fully extended it for a while because of that fear. Now, I've got to go very slow, and I have super safe, very simple ways to begin to introduce that idea. And we start to get gradually the extension back into it, and those ligaments and the meniscus and those parts of the knee joint are craving that pressure.
All right,
They're
all right. This is
craving
important. This is important for me to hear right now, Jeff, because I have also blown out a knee and never had surgery on it, and I'm protective of it for sure. And so
Okay.
I don't always engage my knee in the way that you're saying, but you're giving some important caveats. You're not just like, oh, straighten your knee in all your poses. You're like, if you're going to do it, you're like, oh, you got to be paying attention to what you're doing with your knees. You're doing it in a slower way. I think I heard you say you're doing it in a more sustained way. So it's not like quick bursts.
Yeah.
But you are saying we should be like doing something with our joints that I have not been doing, I don't think. What is it? What is it? So it's about joint health, about keeping your joints healthy. And then I guess there are occasions like my elbows definitely go past straight. Like there are times in certain people who are, like you said, on a spectrum who do have hyperextension, even though some people think they do and they don't. So is it different for that person?
Well, okay, now we're going to define just because your elbow extends more than someone else's, or maybe more than the median extension of an elbow, are we going to label that as wrong?
No.
Are you just going to stop extending it? Now, if you walk through life with, displaying your these elbows, and you do it all the time, that would be weird. But what I'm saying is periodically, a couple times a week is really all you need, where you very thoughtfully go into that full extension. You can do it sitting in your chair right here. It's actually full engagement of the tricep muscle group. And that's it.
I get it. What I would say is, and it's why I was in favor of some amount of bend depending on the person, is that there's a principle, and I'm getting this from a friend of mine, Amy Matthews, who talks about like even distribution, like of effort through your body. And so like if I'm in a downward facing dog position and I let my arms go all the way straight, the effort of being in that is all loading into my joint right there. If I bend it to a degree where it then distributes through into my shoulder, down the pathways, the fascial lines, if you will, then that's what I mean when I say it breaks or something, where it's not distributing in the effort isn't evenly distributing through someone's body,
Yes. Okay. So we might surmise from that, Jay, that downward dog at this point is just too much for your elbow. And I would say, okay, if that's your experience in downward dog, then let's go to the wall.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of Jay Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.